friends, Ben with Food Facts here. I'm sitting with Brandon Friedman at Rakkasan Tea Company in Dallas, Texas. He is pouring us, will you introduce the tea? What are we drinking here?
So this is it's a Sri Lankan black tea. It's a wild tea, which is very rare in tea consumption. This tea's got a pretty cool story. It comes from an abandoned tea estate. It was abandoned in 1890. It was only in operation for about 10 years by some Scottish farmers that planted the tea field in Sri Lanka, and then they abandoned it 10 years later. And it stayed that way until 2018. So for about 128 years, it was abandoned and overgrown. In 2018, our supplier, who's a young guy who knows a lot about tea, bought the property, took it over, and started harvesting the wild tea leaves from these giant trees. And so what we get now are, this is wild tea, wild grown tea.
So is this one for sale on your site?
It is.
Okay.
It is. It's called Warnagala Wild.
Okay.
From the Warnagala Tea Estate. Yeah, it's a good Ceylon black tea.
Smells amazing. So Brandon runs the Rakkasan Tea Company. Obviously, he's the tea master here. And I think the story of how I found you guys is kind of pertinent because there's a connection there. So I want to dive into that real quick. I had been watching some sort of tea coverage on CBS. I don't even remember the company they were talking about. And I like tea, but I drink tea out of a bag from the grocery store. And I said, man, I need to find like a local tea company that does the real stuff. And I Googled tea company in Dallas because I live just north of Dallas. Yeah. And Rakkasan Tea Company popped up. And I said, well, that's weird considering I spent 4 years in the Rakkasans in Fort Campbell, Kentucky in the 1st of the 187th Infantry Battalion, which I think I messaged you and you said, oh yeah, I was in the 1187 too. I said, well, this is real weird. So I was like, well, we've got to do an interview, and I reached out to Brandon. He was kind enough to organize this. So I'm sure some of our veteran friends will see this and know exactly what Rakkasan is, but can you explain to the greater YouTube community, what are the Rakkasans? What does that mean?
Yeah, so Rakkasans, so that is the 3rd Brigade of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division. The name is transliterated from Japanese as falling down umbrella, and this is the old Japanese word for parachutist. Falling down umbrella men is what they call them. And the name comes from the World War II occupation of Japan, when the Rakkasans were part of that occupation. So this is the 187th Infantry Regiment, was then nicknamed the Rakkasans. And it's been kind of a famous unit in the Army ever since.
Yeah. Let's jump over to you and just start from the beginning.
So I'm originally from Shreveport, Louisiana. I grew up around iced tea and sweet tea and hated it. Never liked it, always avoided it. Don't think I ever had hot tea in my life until I was in the Army. But anyway, I got through college and got commissioned as an infantry officer in the 101st Airborne Division. I took over my first rifle platoon on September 16th, 2001.
Oh, wow.
So 5 days after 9/11. And that was kind of drinking out of a fire hose. And 7 or 8 weeks later, we were on the C-17 headed to Pakistan.
Wow.
And spent a little time there, and then we went into Afghanistan. Was involved in combat in Afghanistan. Went back to Pakistan, then came home. Was home for about 9 months, and then went to Kuwait for the Iraq invasion.
Wow.
So did the Iraq invasion, came home, got out of the Army. 2 tours was enough for me.
Sure.
But it was interesting because, especially in Iraq, we worked a lot with local people, doing all kinds of stuff, whether it was in Baghdad, northern Iraq, wherever. And if you've ever been there, you don't do anything with anybody unless it's over tea.
Right.
So we did a lot of tea drinking, and so that was sort of my introduction to hot tea. Because, like I said, I don't even think I'd ever had it before.
Well, I think a lot of people's assumption of tea time is English tea with cakes and crumpets.
Yeah, ladies with big hats
and biscuits and
yeah.
But to your point, over there it's socializing was first before you got into business, and that was done around tea.
Well, first, I mean, the first thing that I would bring up is that stereotype that we have in the U.S. about the ladies in big hats and tea and crumpets and the pinkies and all that. So that wasn't my introduction to hot tea. Like I was aware of that stereotype, but my introduction to hot tea was drinking tea before a combat mission with dudes with bandoliers of, AK-47 rounds, ready to get into a fight.
Far from the big hats and
right. Yeah, this is not high tea in London. This is something very different, and that was my introduction to tea. So it's it's not what most people. It's not how most people were introduced to tea. I don't think, especially here in the U.S. But for me, that experience of sharing tea with people there, it was, we were getting in a lot of fights and a lot of, not great stuff happening. Having tea with people there was almost like it was kind of an oasis amid the chaos of combat. Just being able to relax and chill out.
A pause point.
Yeah, and have some tea and sort of be a human being.
Sure.
Was always really great. So
I think that's a really unique introduction to tea. I mean, there's a small percentage of Americans who serve in the first place, and then you go over and experience this culture that does things different from how we do it. Yeah. Which I think that's also unique. I've talked to my family about things I experienced in my short time in Afghanistan that changed my perspective on how I have an outlook on life in general.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting to touch on that. It sounds like tea it changed your trajectory, really.
Well, it did, for sure. In a lot of ways. Primarily, I got to know a lot of people over there over tea, which is great. But I also, just personally, and other people, you don't have to go to Iraq or Afghanistan to get this. But,
sure.
But I learned to consume a beverage like this and use it sort of as a thing that can just help you slow down.
Yeah.
And relax and have good conversation. In the U.S., a lot of times this is done over alcohol.
Right.
Which is fine. But in the Middle East, there's not as much alcohol consumption, so they do it over tea.
Sure.
And one of the things I realized about tea is that it's very different from coffee. They both have caffeine. Black tea has about half the caffeine of coffee, but tea also has other elements to it, like L-theanine, which is an amino acid, which sort of gives you that sense of calm. But with tea, what I found with tea is, and what we say today is that coffee is kind of the go drink, tea is the stop drink.
Okay.
Coffee is what people have on their way to the office.
Right.
To get woken up in the morning, they have it, on the subway on their way in. They're carrying the briefcase. They got their coffee. Right. Don't talk to me until I've had my coffee.
Yeah.
To wake them up.
It's a culture.
Yeah, that's coffee culture. Tea is the opposite. Tea is what you consume when you're ready to slow down.
Right.
Like I need something to dial me back, from an 11 back to like a 6. Tea is the stop drink. Coffee is also a very solitary drink. Like people drink their coffee on the way to work, in the morning, like to get woken up, they have coffee. Tea is almost always consumed like with people. It's tea time. Like, let's make tea.
No, you're right. We do hot and cold tea at my house. The wife and I do chamomile in the evenings almost religiously. It's like, to your point, it's our wind down.
Yeah.
Moving into the business, so you came back, you got out of the military, you went into politics, is that accurate, for a little bit?
Yeah, I came back, went to grad school, ended up writing a memoir. It came out in 2007. Then I decided I didn't want to be a writer. But I got involved in politics and I worked in politics for over a decade. First, I worked for an organization called Vote Vets, which gets veterans involved in politics and running for office. And then I joined the Obama administration in Washington, D.C., moved there. I lived in D.C. for 8 years. I worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And when the Trump administration came in, we decided to leave and move back to Texas.
And then so established roots in Dallas.
Yeah.
Where did the idea of the tea company come from?
So a couple places. So I left the administration in 2015 to start a PR firm with a friend of mine. We were ready to just go out on our own and start a business, doing, communications and stuff. It sort of flamed out after a couple of years, because I didn't really know what I was doing. Like, I'd never started a business, and I was like, how hard can it be?
Right.
To start a business. My dad's cousin called me about it. He was like, why are you doing services? Why aren't you selling a product? And I was like, I don't know, Alan.
Right.
I'm not sure. I don't know. And so that sort of planted a seed in my head, like, because he said, when you're selling a product, you're making money while you're sleeping at night. People are buying it online, and when you're selling services, you're not making money unless you're working.
Right.
As a consultant. I was like, that's a great idea.
Right.
This is very smart. You probably have an MBA, which he does. In which I didn't. So I started researching it. I started researching it in October 2016. I didn't know anything about the tea industry, but what I learned really fast was that there was a lot of really great tea being grown in places that wasn't making it to the United States. All the tea coming in here comes from China, India, Japan, Taiwan. And it made me realize that a lot of these countries that are producing great tea and aren't exporting it to the U.S. are also countries that have been torn apart by war.
Right.
These are, countries like Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia, and I was thinking, well, that's interesting. I know a little about conflict,
right?
Civil conflict, international conflict, and I started thinking, I could go in there and get tea from these places, and it'd be kind of a cool story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that was what led us to the idea of promoting peace and economic development by importing tea solely from. The idea then was post-conflict countries. Anyway, so I moved back to Dallas. I hooked up with a guy that I had served 2 tours with in Iraq and Afghanistan, who was looking to do something different and leave his job in the oil business. And I said, why don't you come, join the tea company? So we got the tea company started here in Texas.
And what year did y'all start?
This was 2017.
Okay.
So we filed the paperwork in July 2017, and we started selling in November 2017.
Okay.
And
where was the first place you imported tea from?
So we started off with 7 teas from, I think, 3 countries.
Okay.
So we started with tea from Rwanda, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Nepal was less than 10 years from a civil war. Sri Lanka had just ended a 30-year-long civil conflict, and of course Rwanda had gone through the genocide in the 1990s,
right?
And it's been recovering ever since then.
So how did you make, for those first 7 teas that you got, how did you make those connections?
Well,
did they already establish?
Well, like you said, it's kind of like being a drug dealer. Well, I'll give you an example. So our first Sri Lankan tea supplier, I reached out to a guy I knew in DC who was running a nonprofit that helped veteran-owned companies get involved in international business.
Okay.
He knew a guy at the State Department who knew a guy at USAID who knew a British expat who had started a small organic tea farm in Sri Lanka.
Wow.
And through that chain of people, I got introduced to Simon, who's the British guy in Sri Lanka. And he was kind enough to take my call. We talked on a Skype call for like an hour, and he sort of walked me through stuff. And I was thinking like, oh, we can just get all of our tea from you. And he was, his thing was like, no. You can need other suppliers. We don't make enough. Like, we're very small. Like, he was like, I only got 30 employees, at the whole tea farm. So, and I've got, a number of customers around the world. And then I'd moved back to Dallas for the Nepali tea and was working with Kyle Stewart, who's sort of a luminary in the American tea community. And he introduced me to Jenny Dodd, who is another big time tea person in the U.S. And she's an expert on Nepalese tea. Okay. So she splits her time between Manhattan and Kathmandu, and she knows all the people in the Nepali tea industry and where you get the good tea, where you get the good stuff in Nepal. Sure. And so she was able to connect us with, farmers there. And since then, it's just been kind of sort of a networking web. Right. The specialty tea business is very small, and everybody kind of knows each other. And you'll have, if I'm looking for something, I can reach out to somebody and ask them, like, hey, do you know where I can get this type of tea? And there'll be like an email chain, and you just kind of have to track it down. And it was like that for a few years. And then what started happening was that these small farmers in these war zones or post-conflict countries started reaching out to us. And it flipped. The word had spread. Yeah, the word had spread. It flipped from, we were looking for these farmers to all of a sudden now these small farmers are like, hey, we hear there's this company that will distribute our Vietnamese tea, like in the U.S. We'll have access to like U.S. tea drinkers in the U.S. market. Like, we got to reach out to those guys. Have you gone out to visit some of these locations? We haven't been able to. COVID probably threw a wrench in a lot of it. Yeah, COVID's a whole other story. That was a nightmare. If you did anything with supply chains, especially internationally during COVID, it was disaster. Terrible. Yeah, sure. And it sucked for us because we're primarily an online company. Mm-hmm. It was great because it was great for business because people were home, stuck at home, so they were buying online. But where we ran into the problem was I couldn't get the tea. But you guys have rebounded. I mean, now you're up to 60. We've got like 65 teas now. Okay. From 7? Started off with 7 when we launched in 2017. So in 7 years, we moved up to 65 teas. It went from you learning about tea in Iraq in a social setting to utilizing a social network to create a tea business. Yeah. Which is pretty cool. Thank you. What are the primary differences between the tea and the tea bags that you're getting at the store and what y'all are offering? Is it commercialization or is there more to it? The difference has to do with quality and grade. When you buy most grocery store tea bag tea, you're getting what's called dust or fannings, which is just the ground up. It's essentially the leftovers. And it's very strong often. Some of it's not bad. I mean, some of it's pretty good. But the difference with we sell mostly loose leaf tea, which is actual leaves. Mm-hmm. And you will get greater complexity with the flavor. So you're primarily online company, so folks should just go to your website to see what teas you have to offer. Is there special way to do it? Is there something to look for? They've got a lot of options. If I'm going on there and I don't know much about tea, what should I do? Yeah, so if you go to the website, which is rakkasontea.com, you can see all the teas. They're broken down by types of tea. So if you want black tea or green tea or oolong, whatever. And each tea has a product entry, which tells you a little bit about the tea, gives you steeping instructions, shows you how to do it. Awesome. Well, Brandon, thanks for having this conversation. Thanks for bringing me in. It was fun to talk about the connection and learn about tea and hear your food, more drink story. But appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yes, sir.